So here we have a very simple environmental control system pack. Often people call them air conditioning packs. The pack itself does cool the air, but it also manages heating it back up too. It controls heating. So to call it an air conditioning pack is kind of a misnomer. There isn't really a separate heat and cool. In basic systems, you looked at vapor cycle machines or vapor cycle systems that produce cold air. And then you had a separate heater in terms of like a fuel-fired heater or an exhaust type heater. On transport aircraft, the heat is already there. Right? The air we're pulling off the engines is already 300 or 400 degrees. And so we've got plenty of heat available. In fact, we've got too much. We're never going to take that raw bleed air and send it in as heat. But we do need to come up with a source of cold air that we mix in with it in order to get temperate air. So this is probably the simplest pack I've seen. So what we have is, here is our hot air coming into the right side of the primary heat exchanger. Okay? And that's that bleed air, and when that bleed air comes in, it's too hot to use for anything initially. And so these heat exchangers, there's the secondary and primary, and it's called the primary because that's where bleed air goes first. Okay? A right here, A to B, is our overboard cooling air. So that's cold ambient outside air. At altitude, it may be negative 40 or negative 50 degrees. And at negative 40, it doesn't matter if it's Celsius or Fahrenheit, it's the same thing. So we'll say negative 40 degrees, even on the ground, this is still cooler. Now on a hot day, these don't work as efficiently, especially a hot, humid day. But that cooling air is going to cross these heat exchangers. Now, it never mixes with that bleed air, right? The bleed air is at 45, 50 psi. The cooling air is at ambient. It might only be a couple psi when you're up at high altitude. So that hot air comes through the primary heat exchanger. Now, that's actually the second heat exchanger this air is going, the cooling air is going through, but it's the first heat exchanger that the bleed air goes through. And that brings the temperature down a little bit. And in this case, after it goes through that, we take a certain amount of it and we kind of siphon it off, and that can skip the whole thing. That's our hot air source. Okay? Some aircraft, they do pull the raw hot air and send it over. Again, the design of these, though it's similar, the details of it can be slightly different from aircraft to aircraft. Okay? This is one of the ones that I mentioned, the air cycle machine here also drives that fan to provide ground cooling air movement on the ground. Overboard cooling air movement on the ground. And so in flight, this would probably have some kind of a ram air scoop on it, but on the ground, this fan is going to be moving majority of the air. And that's, in this case, driven directly by our turbine that we'll get to in a minute. So air comes out of that primary heat exchanger at number 1. It's fairly hot still. It goes into our compressor, and it gets pushed out at the number 2 there. And so what's going to happen to it as it comes from 1 to 2? What's that air going to experience? What's going to happen to the air? And when I say what's going to happen, we're looking at things like temperature, pressure, that kind of thing. It's going to have an increase in temperature. It's actually a pretty significant increase in temperature. It'll bring it back up. This might be 400 coming in. It might drop it down to 250 here. It's probably back up to 400 here. Okay? Energy has been put back into it. Where did that energy come from? It came from boosting the pressure, which came from this turbine on the other side. So we're transferring energy through this shaft from air later into this earlier air. Okay? So it comes back out at 2, it's hot again. Now it goes through a secondary heat exchanger. Okay, again, that's picking up, that's taking that heat and moving it into outside ambient air that's going to get dumped overboard. So now it comes out of there, it's cooled down again. It's still under pressure though. It comes to number 3 and it enters our turbine. And what happens to it as it goes through the turbine? What's it going to do? So it's an expansion turbine. It's going to expand. And when we allow a volume of air to expand, what happens to it? The temperature is going to drop and pressure is going to drop. It's going to come back down to that 45 5 psi-ish. It's got to be similar pressure to what was coming through at number 5 here. Okay, otherwise, if it was too high, it would backfeed into 5. If it was too low, 5 would backfeed up through the wrong way and turn that into a compressor, or kind of a weird turbine thing. I don't know what it would do. It just wouldn't work. And so now that air, number 3, goes through the turbine, the expansion. So that temperature decreases, the pressure decreases, energy is extracted in the form of mechanical motion by spinning the turbine. So that's that energy that's used to spin the compressor and spin the fan. So now we got cold air coming out at 4, and we mix, and that cold air can get as cold, it can get real cold, to the point where you can actually get freezing, it can go below the freezing temperature. Now the risk there is if there's moisture in it, you'll start to get ice buildup on the turbine, and that can cause these to go out of balance and basically tear themselves apart, because they're spinning upwards of 40 to 60,000 RPM in some case. Okay? These things are spinning really fast. And so you don't want any ice buildup on there. So there's typically some kind of limit, the valves that control this, the valve that would be here that lets heat in, hot air in to the right of the primary heat exchanger, or in this case a mixing valve, or some are going to have an anti-ice valve, have the ability to unload that air cycle machine in order to prevent that ice from getting too cold. And so the air coming out of the turbine oftentimes is just above freezing, maybe a few degrees above freezing. And then we mix in some air, from number 5, maybe that air is 250, 300 degrees. And when you get the ratios right, you can get air coming out of there at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 21, 25 degrees Celsius for our international student. And then we can send that to the cabin, and it's nice and comfy for all the passengers, except for grandma, who thinks it's always too cold, except for the big burly dude who always thinks it's too hot, and nobody can agree. So that air gets routed into the ventilation and distribution system in order to do the cabin. If we look at something that's a little bit more complicated, same elements, we still have a primary and secondary heat exchanger. This actually shows the pre-cooler, which normally is on the engine. We've still got our compressor, and we've still got our turbine. Now we've added in another part you're always going to see, which is water separators. And that's because that cold air coming off, we don't want to send a bunch of moisture through the vents. One is it builds up inside the cabin and can cause corrosion and make it feel clammy and gross. The other is, if it's cold enough, it'll come out as visible moisture. And what does visible moisture look like to the untrained eye of a passenger? It looks like smoke being blown out of the vents. We don't want passengers thinking that we are smoking them out of the cabin, even though it's would be water vapor. Now, when these water separators, sometimes they get overwhelmed, and you still get that. Atlanta, Georgia, in the middle of summer, we would often have water vapor coming out, visible moisture coming out of our vents. And people from Atlanta just kind of got used to that. They're like, yep, I get on the plane, it looks like it's full of smoke. It's more of a magic show going on, Houdini's going to walk up and do his disappearing act. So again, here's our bleed air coming in. It actually goes through a pre-cooler and a heat exchanger. It's cooled down a bit. We take some of that air and we route it off. You can see there's actually some raw high temperature bleed air that's routed off. So this pack actually mixes cold, medium, and high temperature air. It's got a kind of a dual mixing thing going on. So that air that's gone through the heat exchanger, it goes into the compressor, it gets hot again, temperature's high. Now we go into our secondary heat exchanger, and a little bit of air is going to this thing called an aspirator. We'll talk to that in a minute. And then the rest of it goes through a little water separator here. It's cooled down, it gets some of the water separator. This has an overboard drain, so there's actually 2 water separators. Then it goes to our expansion turbine. Out of that, it's cold, it goes up here. Now we can mix this dual bypass valve, or mixing valve can mix in that medium and high temperature air to get comfortable air that's going to go to the cabin, right? This one's another one where the turbine here is driving the compressor. It's also driving a ground cooling fan. In flight, ram air comes in here, bypasses that fan, and goes over the heat exchangers. Okay. This is a check valve right here, this arrow pointing down to the left of the ram air duct. So air can travel this way or air can travel this way. And then it goes over those heat exchangers, gets overboard. And so you can see it's got the same things. Now, one cool thing here, the water separator up here, we have to do something with the water. There's a small one here, it overboards it. But the main water separator, before the air goes to the cabin, comes off and comes down and hooks to that same aspirator. So that air that we're running through the aspirator is going to pick up the water and it's spraying it into the cooling air stream. What's that going to do? Why would we shoot it in there rather than just dumping it overboard like this one? Yeah. It'll land on these heat exchangers and then it will evaporate. And what's it going to do when it evaporates? It's going to increase the efficiency in the cooling taking place in the heat exchangers. Kind of slick, isn't it? Use something that's waste to help make it run more efficient. You'll see that in a lot of these. They use that waste water, that waste moisture to run the heat, to make the heat exchangers more efficient. Okay. And then looking through this, you can see there's various temp sensors, pressure switches, pressure transmitters, temp sensors, temp outlet. You know, again, that feeds into the control and the monitoring. Here's another one. This is that one I showed earlier. Now this one adds a second turbine. So it's actually got two turbines, a compressor. This one, the fan is electrically driven. It's not, there's no shaft here. It's an electric fan. Okay. So again, here's our hot air coming in at the left. Some of it goes around the top. That's got a pressure and temperature sensor on the valve. That's what the P and T there are. Okay. There's our hot air that can come in. This is our outlet on the right in green. Okay, so there is our temp control valve right there at the top with the P, with the pressure and temperature sensors on it. The air that goes into the pack goes through a primary heat exchanger, gets compressed. Okay, now it can take a path where what's called the add heat valve. The add heat valve allows air to come to the second turbine. That's if that second turbine gets too cold, it's to prevent it from icing up. It's an ice prevention thing. So most of the time, most of that air is not going to go to the add heat valve. It's going to go into the compressor. It's going to come out of the compressor, going to go to the secondary heat exchanger. Then it goes through something called a reheater condenser. So what happens here is it's cold. It gets even colder by putting heat into the air going this way. When it gets cold, that makes the water come out of it. There's our water going to our aspirator. Then the water's been removed. Now we heat it back up again. So it's an air-to-air heat exchanger with the bleed air doing its thing. It's exchanging to itself in order to help make the water separation work better. Then it goes to the first expansion turbine. And you can see there's a bypass here, M. Okay. M's a low limit valve. What that does, again, if the temperature is too cold at the outlet of this turbine, that valve will open to unload it so that you don't get ice buildup there. M comes down here, goes through the other part of the condenser now. You know, it's cold, right? So that's what's making the air cold for this water collector. Goes to the second turbine, gets really cold. Now we mix warm air back, hot air back into it to make warm air or temperate air. Concept's the same, works the same. A little more complicated, a little more going on. This is a more modern aircraft. This is the Embraer 175. That's a CRJ 200. That's just a simple drawing. Here's the 727. I'm not going to go through it step by step, but this is another one. It's got a single turbine, single compressor. It's got the water separator. Here's our mixing valve. Hot air, medium air, cold air. Heat exchangers, ram air. There's our pack cooling fan. Heat exchangers are there. The one thing that's interesting here is on the ground or in the air, air is rammed in this front area and goes through the heat exchangers. In flight, sorry, that's in flight. On the ground, air gets pulled in from a vent behind the heat exchangers and comes out through each of them. Now this one, the big difference here, you know, here, the cooling air passes through both heat exchangers. In the case of 727, the airflow is split and only goes through one or the other. that the concept works the same. Those mixing valves, again, they can just be a single valve turning the hot air on and off. They can be some of these dual mixing valves. So here you can see we got cold air, warm air, hot air. You can have just the cold air going through. You really want to, if it needs to be air conditioned, you can run warm air mixed with cold air, kind of make medium air. If you need a lot of heat, the cold air is still coming through because our hot is too hot, and so we mix that. So you can have just cold air, you can have warm and cold air, or you can have hot and cold air. You can't have just the hot air coming through. So again, those all mixed together, gives us nice tempered air. Again, for most people it's comfortable. For Granny it's too cold. Big burly dude, it's too hot. Flight attendants are sick of hearing about it. You know, you call them. Okay, we'll change the temperature. And they go back to playing on their phone up at the flight attendant station. Yeah. No. The turbine drives the compressor. The air moving through it, you got high pressure air at 3 here, is what's pushing the turbine. And as it's pushing it, the air is expanding in the turbine, right? It's kind of, think about a turbine engine, right? The exhaust gases go through the turbine and expand, and that's what drives the compressor. This is working the same way, okay? So the high pressure air is going through the turbine, it's expanding. That expansion is pushing against the turbine vanes, turbine blades, and causing it to spin. And then the shaft, that's driving the compressor, and in this case, the fan as well. Okay, it's that expanding gas, that expanding bleed air coming from 3 is putting energy into the turbine to make it spin, to spin it. Or here you've got 2 turbines. You know, in both cases, the air coming in here is expanding, and the air coming in here is expanding even more. And so these 2 turbines are piggyback to each other. They're driving the compressor. I actually misspoke. That's right. This one, it does drive the fan as well. It's not an electric fan. The 727 has an electric fan. Okay. So the operation of these, you saw they have a lot of different pressure and temperature sensors and various things like that. Most of the time they're going to run in an automatic mode, and that is the crew. And when I say crew, it could be older airplanes that tend to just be the cockpit crew, just the flight deck crew. They would set the temperature up there. Newer aircraft with more advanced, what are called cabin management systems, the flight attendants have control. And not only do they have control of the whole cabin, they actually have, it's zonal based. So you can actually select temperatures for kind of the forward part of the cabin, the middle part of the cabin, the aft part of the cabin, something like an A380 or a 747, the upper deck versus the lower deck. The cabin management systems on larger, newer aircraft have gotten very, very sophisticated, where the flight attendants have basically, the newest ones are a touch screen, and they can just set the temperature in different zones of the aircraft. Compared to when we were in running the 727, you saw there was basically one knob for the flight deck and one knob for the entire passenger cabin, and that was it. And it was all done up in the flight deck. And if it was too cold in the back, the flight attendants would have to pick up the interphone, call the flight deck, say, hey, it's too cold, turn it up. So they turned it up. Well, now it's too hot, turn it down. The flight engineer would have to turn it down. Now it's run right from that display that's typically right by the main entry door or in the galley area by the flight attendants. And so that's automatic. It controls the things like the valves, the different fans, and other items like that. But essentially, you select a temperature, and then the computer tries to maintain that by varying the position of the mixing valve or the bypass valve or whatever it is that mixes the cold and hot air, or the cold, the warm, and the hot air. When you go into a manual mode, this is almost always done by the cockpit. Okay, so if for some reason a air conditioner system has to be switched to manual, if it's an airplane where the cabin management system is able to control it in automatic, that's going to be disabled. And that's because there's more monitoring that has to take place, and you have to be able to make sure that you don't exceed the limits. And what I mean by exceed the limits is freeze the expansion turbine or overheat the system. And so now in the flight deck, you are able to directly control the mixing valve or the bypass valve rather than having a computer do it. And in the most extreme case, some of these don't even have safeties on them. The planes I work, the CRJ-200, doesn't have a safety system on it. So if you turn that pack on, you open the valve that sends air to the pack and you put it in manual mode, whatever position that valve is in is what it's going to do. And if it's fully hot, it's going to dump hot air into the cabin. And if it's fully cold, it's going to freeze the expansion turbine. And it doesn't care because the computer's not even looking at it. We had an incident one night. We had a plane outside. It was winter. APU, we would run our APUs to do heat, and we sent our cleaning crew out there. And we had one cleaner who always fancied himself a bit of a pilot or mechanic. I don't know what his deal was. He was an odd duck. Nice guy with a lot. But he thought he was, he knew what he was doing, so he thought he could get up in the cockpit and start playing with the controls. And so one of the mechanics had gone out, had started the APU, had gotten the heat on, we're making it nice and comfortable for our cleaning crew to go out there and clean. There's about 8 to 10 in a cleaning crew, and they do a deep clean of the whole cabin. And a couple hours later, one of the ladies on the crew comes in, and she is just drenched in sweat. And we're like, what's going on? She said, oh, it's so hot in that plane, we can't, and it's starting to smell really bad. And we go out to the plane, and this gentleman, who again fancied himself a mechanic or a pilot, had switched the packs to manual and had put the bypass or the mixing valve to full hot. And it was about 130 degrees back in the cabin, and it smelled like burning plastic. And the air going into the fiberglass ductwork coming out of the pack was pushing 200 degrees. And it disbonded all the fiberglass ductwork inside the cabin. We had to tear the entire cabin apart, all the panels, all the seats out, all the sidewalls out, all the floor panels out, and replace every single fiberglass duct that was in the air conditioning system. So when I say there are no safeties on some of these, there are absolutely no safeties on some of these. So the flip side to that is if you go full cold, we do it once in a while because it's fun, but it's not good for them. You go full cold, and all of a sudden ice chunks start flying out of the gaspers, the little vent. Don't do that though; it's bad for the turbine. I was never the one to do it. I may have been hit in the face by some ice chunks, but. So after this goes in, now we get it into the cabin, and now we've got to distribute it around. And so under the floor, there's typically some kind of a manifold that this air goes into. And then from there, the airflow, a very common airflow, is from top down, front to back. So the air comes out of the manifold. There's ductwork that runs up the inside walls, kind of behind the sidewall panels, and it comes out up by the overhead bins and passenger service units. Okay? And then that airflow kind of works its way down. You can see it kind of swirls, but it works its way down. And then ultimately, there's little vents in the floor. So this is your passenger cabin. This is cargo and avionics down here. The air then is able to work its way through these vents between the cabin and there. And then it kind of goes down and cools or heats the cargo area. And then in this case, there's a couple of intakes down here for recirculation fans. Suck the air in, and they're showing filters here. Our airplanes that had it, they were HEPA filters. They caught a lot of stuff. You realized how much stuff they caught when you had to go clean one of these suckers. They were about yay big. They looked like a shop vac filter, big pleated filter. You'd pull them out, and they were gross. There's hair on them, dust bunnies on them. Shake them a little bit, and there's just like mystery dust coming off, skin cells, fingernails. They were gross. But that's that top down, so air coming from the top to bottom. The other part of it is it tends to, for most aircraft, it tends to work its way from the front of the aircraft back, or into the cabin, then ultimately back. Because at the back, are your outflow valve and safety valve and that kind of thing for the pressurization system. So the air is coming in, it's flowing around the cabin. There's often a separate kind of manifold up in the flight deck in order to defrost or defog the windows and keep the flight deck warm. And then you've got things like galley fans. The lavatories tend to have air, but they also tend to run negative pressure in the lavatory. They have fans that suck air down below the floor. Why would you do that? Why would you run negative pressure in the lavatory and suck that air down below the floor? Usually backed by the outflow valve. The smell, keep the smell away, right? You don't want the smell coming out of the lavatory into the cabin, right? So you kind of suck that air down. There's usually an exhaust fan in the lavatory as part of this, okay? The other thing that happens is air is routed to the avionics bays and that kind of, it's called a recirculation bay here. And here you have your EEC, your forward electrical bay. You can see air ducts going to those areas or coming from those areas. And so we're going to route air over the various computers and control equipment and everything else that develops heat. When we were doing the fire detection lab on the 727, you heard that loud fan in the forward cargo compartment. I pulled the breaker for it so we could talk to each other. But that was the avionics cooling fan. That's what provides cooling the avionics. It's cold enough out. We weren't running all the avionics. I wasn't worried about it getting too hot, but I also didn't leave it. I don't leave it pulled all the time. Most of the time when the plane's powered up, we leave that running to make sure we have airflow in there. And so that's where you see we've got a main manifold that our air comes into the main manifold, and then it gets sent out to various areas for various purposes. Here's the E&E bay with their fans, the electrical and equipment bay. You know, shown here, various parts of the cabin, air's coming in. There's air being distributed around the cabin. Here's our recirculation. Air's coming from the cabin through the filter, through the fan, and getting pumped into the mixing manifold here. Okay. There's a couple, this one's actually got, this is our pack air coming in this area. Right, coming in here, coming in there. There's also air coming in this way from what's called a trim valve with various mufflers. So you'll see mufflers in these different areas to cut down on the amount of noise making it through. Something I don't have here, and that's not on this, but newer aircraft have it, is they now have an ozone remover on the bleed air ducting. So when you're up at altitude, that air you're pulling in has a high concentration of ozone, O3. O3 is corrosive. It's also found to cause health issues. Okay. You know, the ozone layer and all that, right? It's not good to breathe it. It's been discovered. And so now most of these systems have an ozone separator in them as well, where the air comes from the packs. There's going to be an ozone separator. And they are like a catalytic, they contain a catalyst. It causes the oxygen to, ozone, O3 is less stable than O2, oxygen. And so it causes that extra oxygen atom to basically pop off, and two of them combine to create oxygen. You get rid of the ozone that's in the air. They are life limited. You have to change those out every so often. The catalyst in them doesn't last forever, and so you have to change them out. So those are kind of the newest thing you'll see in these is ozone removers or ozone filters. Okay. So that wraps up environmental control and distribution.